Are you having trouble understanding your indemnification clause in a contract? Then you've come to the right place. I assume that you're not just watching this for fun, but you have searched indemnification. Most people get their review of the concept of indemnification in a contract completely wrong. So I'll explain it to you. You're in the right place. My name's Sarah Sharp. I'm a deal attorney who helps people buy and sell businesses every single day. And I'm the founder of dealacademy.org, where you can learn how to become the expert in all of the pieces of the puzzle that go into buying or selling a business. So check it out. Indemnification. As a concept, it is the amount that a party has to pay to another party for certain breaches of representations, warranties, contract, covenants, things like that. So that probably didn't help you much because it's a little bit of word salad when there's not anything that is attached to it. So indemnification at a very, very high level can mean something really different in each application. So every little piece of the puzzle that makes up an indemnification clause can be, one of 50 different things. And because of that, if you have a whole bunch of different ingredients to the indemnification cake, right, then you change all those ingredients, it can look very, very different. So one indemnification clause might say the seller, is going to pay the buyer back if there's a breach of representation in the contract. And those representations may elsewhere in the contract say they survive for like 12 months. That's a pretty limited result, right? That's just, okay, well, if you're kind of agreeing that I have a breach of contract claim against you and that you'll pay for it for a brief period of time. In a different context, you might have an indemnification clause that says the seller or buyer are going to pay each other for anything that happens, on their side of the court. So seller's on the hook for stuff prior to closing, buyer's on the hook for stuff closing and after. They're going to pay each other back, and that will include not just their own breaches of contract or representations or covenants, but also third-party claims. And so that has a completely different look and application to things than the first one. So the little ingredients that go into making the indemnification clause are very important, and they're not boilerplate. Don't fall into the trap of you get this kind of rhythmic reading of a contract, and especially when it's filled with stuff that you don't understand, and you just kind of move on thinking that it must always say that way. Like it doesn't. They're very unique. The scope of what people are agreeing to pay each other back for is different from contract to contract, and it should be. The amount of time you're on the hook is different from contract to contract, but there's a lot of similarities, right? Like a lot of times you'll have a cap, and that's what this is about, is indemnification caps. So that's a maximum amount that either person is on the hook for. It's like a contractual limit on the amount that a party must pay to the other party in the indemnification clause. So if that is triggered, then you know that worst case scenario, you're not going to be paying $1 billion for something. You're going to have a limitation to it. And they're super important for just, risk protectiveness from the seller's perspective. So if you're a seller of a business, when I represent a seller, I care about almost only two things: getting them paid and limiting their liability. It's much more complex when you're representing the buyer. You have a ton more stuff that you care about. From a seller's perspective, you can be pretty two-channel single-mindedness about, making sure you get paid and limit your liability. So on a go-forward basis, you're going to want a cap that's pretty low on your indemnification obligations. And on the buyer side, they're going to want a cap that's pretty high. So you can see the tension that is present, right? So let me explain to you what I normally see in the market and how this is resolved in the sub $5 million business acquisition group. First, check out letter of intent course at dealacademy.org. We talk a lot more about indemnification in a lot more detail because I'm so crazy that I do think you should address this in your letter of intent. Okay, so what should the cap be? If you Google this, you get the wrong answer. If you open AI it, you get the wrong answer still, even though I'm trying to train the AI. So there are some deal term studies. A deal term study is just a hyper analysis of a bunch of deals that have taken place. And it's very rare for somebody to be well situated to do such a deal term study because, for instance, like really big law firms, I just saw a report, and the biggest deal M&A firms in the nation do like 30 deals a year. So I personally do around 50 because mine are smaller. So I have pretty robust sample size. Other people who are like vendors, for instance, SRS Acquium puts out a deal term study. They do escrow and kind of shareholder type services. So they have an insight into lots of different deals as just a vendor outsider. So they have a deal term study that I constantly get referred to me in support of, just like a variety of opinions. And some people will say, okay, in this big deal term study, indemnification caps are like 10% of the purchase price. That is true. I have seen the deal term studies. They do say that. That is so low as to be meaningless in the context of a small transaction. So I have dug in on these deal term studies, and they don't even distinguish a deal size below 25 million. So if you have a $1 million deal and you're trying to adopt the terms of a deal term study that doesn't even distinguish between 25 million and $1 million in purchase price, you're gonna overdo it and you're gonna negotiate for really weird positions. One of the reasons that indemnification cap at the mid-market, meaning 20 million and up, 20 million to about 200 million, is treated differently is because at that level, it makes sense to bring in reps and warranties insurance. So a lot of deals will be done with a third party who's just floating around to suck up some of that liability and risk. That does not usually make sense at my level, sub $5 million in purchase price. Although, maybe hit me up if you want to start a product to sell to people to have that. It's called RWI insurance for the smaller transactions. I think that'd be lovely. But usually that's not available. So you have just two parties instead of three apportioning risk between themselves. So 10%, I would probably not want to move forward with in a $5 million or below transaction. But I do think it's reasonable to start thinking about the cash received at closing as a limitation on some liability in that indemnification clause. So that's probably as low as I would get. Somewhere between the cash received at closing and the overall purchase price seems to be a reasonable risk apportionment in small deals, because it's reasonable for the seller to say, I don't want to have to be out of pocket by virtue of selling my business. That's too far. If you pay me $1 million for my business and then I get sued, I need to know that I'm not going to be paying, out of pocket more money than I even made for the whole transaction to deal with these indemnification claims. That can be appropriate, but that's all assuming that you have a deal where the parties are pretty similarly situated and there isn't some big weird outlier claim like an ongoing data breach or something that the parties are anxious about. If that's the case, you might have no cap, or you might have a really super duper high cap. And in any event, if you have an indemnification clause and you then have a cap on the indemnification, responsibility of, let's say, anywhere between the cash at closing to the purchase price of the whole deal, great. You still need to make sure that you exclude from that cap breaches that are a result of fraud and intentional or gross misconduct and that kind of thing, because it doesn't make sense to let somebody just completely have the ability to intentionally screw you over and have negotiated a cap on those damages. You can imagine the antithetical to fair outcomes that could result from that. So indemnification caps, they're not as complex as it sounds, but you're also not going to get good intel out there because there's just not a granularity in people's research of how these deals are done. The vast majority either have no cap at all, or the cap is somewhere between the amount received at closing and, let's say, 2x the purchase price. That is what I see in the market and what other attorneys that are similarly situated see as well. If you found this valuable, please like and subscribe. Check out dealacademy.org, share it with your friends and family.